Welcome, Chris. Chris is the Director of the Council for Arab-British Understanding and the organisation's lead spokesperson. And he's been very active in calling for a ceasefire, being at the forefront of this whole debate around the ceasefire and a future for Palestine. And I think it's really important that we catch up with Chris today because so much has happened in just a past couple of weeks. And of course, in this country, in Britain, we have a general election. Gaza and Palestine, Israel are part of that general election. It's a campaign issue on the doorsteps. But I just wondered if I could begin, Chris, by just running through some, and you'll probably have a better grasp of memory than me of just what's been happening over the past 2 or 3 weeks. We've had the ruling by the International Criminal Court, the recommendation of arrest warrants for named leaders of Hamas, also for the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, and for his Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant. We've had the ruling by the International Court of Justice calling upon Israel to stop its military actions in Rafah. We had Egypt joining with South Africa at the ICJ. We had Norway, Spain, and Belgium recognizing the state of Palestine and being accused by the Israeli government of rewarding Hamas. We had, of course, the bombing of a refugee camp, possibly on multiple occasions, but certainly the one that has been recorded and made the most, and has been picked up by global media, has been the one that killed many civilians in their tents in Rafah, for which there was global condemnation and a promise, once again, by the Israeli government for an investigation. Now, all of this has happened. At the same time, the United States has continued to effectively give the green light to Israeli military actions in Gaza and in Rafah. And the British government, Lord Cameron, the foreign minister, actually, as you know, said it was all right for Britain to continue to supply weapons, despite the fact that there was a brief interlude when the Americans stopped. I mean, sometimes, Chris, when you step back from all of this, do you wonder if there is very much Arab-British understanding left?
It's a great question, and that's a wonderful summary of the last month. And I would say that certainly that 6th of May was an extraordinary date when we really saw Israeli forces going in to Rafah. They tried to pretend it was some sort of mini ground invasion, not the full-scale one, but I think it's very clear this is the operation. It's not going to stop. It's not any different from what had been contemplated. And it's very much Israel is conducting its operations in Gaza as per usual, as it has done over 8 months. That's where we're coming up to 8 months of this conflict. And with a promise from Israeli ministers, the Israeli National Security Advisor, Tzachi Hanegbi, says this could go on for another 7 months. So what's happening in 7 months' time? Well, we might have a new president in the White House. So this whole month has seen in many ways the fracturing of the international community becoming even clearer. Remind you that back in March, President Biden said, going into Rafah is a red line. You know, he went on the record. We had British, government saying that they opposed an invasion of Rafah. And then when it happens, we got all this crazy sort of language. Oh, it's not the operation, or we haven't seen a plan, therefore we can't tell if that plan is legal or illegal or not. And as things have gone forward, we have seen really a grotesque attempt to try to justify the unjustifiable. And then in contrast with these two major legal bodies, the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, beginning to show some teeth, but being threatened as well. International Court of Justice making yet more rulings, more provisional measures, as it did in January and March, and has now done this month, including about Rafah, and certainly to let that aid in. And I remind you all that since Israel went into Rafah, we haven't seen that Rafah border opening. We've seen less aid going into Gaza. The starvation levels in Gaza are now affecting, according to the IPC, 1.1 million people in Gaza. Absolutely extraordinary. This is a man-made famine that's being brought about. This is not some accident of nature. So we saw all of that. Then we have the International Criminal Court. Many people felt that this was somewhat late in the day. And eventually, the chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, comes out with two of his colleagues to launch this video that he is going to seek arrest warrants for those Hamas leaders you mentioned, but also the Israeli Prime Minister and Defense Minister. I think there's some surprises in that. I think you almost certainly legally could have made that case against those Hamas leaders months ago. I think that's a legitimate criticism. It's not that Hamas was ever in denial of what they'd done. They boasted about it. So why wait? But also, what has the International Criminal Court been doing on the investigation that it opened years ago? There are settlements expanding in the West Bank, settler violence going on there. The building of settlements is a clear violation of the Rome Statute. This is not an issue that is disputed. There's no dispute in fact. These settlements are there, they're being expanded. But finally, International Criminal Court is seemingly taking action through the chief prosecutor. And then we find out this extraordinary investigation into the actions of the Israeli security apparatus to intimidate the International Criminal Court, the judges, those who are working there, and even a report about the way in which the then head of Mossad, a close ally of Prime Minister Netanyahu, actually tried to intimidate in a one-on-one meeting the former chief prosecutor, Bensouda. Quite extraordinary. It's like The Sopranos. It's the same sort of thing, you get in the United States. You had 12 American Republican senators saying that they should sanction the chief prosecutor and his family. I mean, this is gangster state, mafia style politics of the worst type. So, yes, it is extraordinary. It seems that it is business as usual as Israel continues to prosecute what many people see as a genocide going on in Gaza, certainly war crimes, crimes against humanity. There seems to be no end in sight. And the United States, the primary sponsor, the aider and abetter of this process, is being silent, complicit, and so too, I am afraid, is our own country, Britain, who has gone along with this, who occasionally murmurs expressions of concern, or even on a bad day, deep concern about what is going on, but refuses to do anything about it.
And sometimes the situation almost seems surreal. We have a White House spokesperson who stands up. He's questioned by journalists about allegations that the munitions dropped on that camp in Rafah, where over 40 civilians were killed, mainly women and children. He's asked about this, and he says there's no evidence to suggest yet. They're looking into, etc., etc. And at the same time, CNN is actually playing film footage of the same missiles, or what's left of them, showing quite clearly that they're made in the United States. And so we also have, on a much bigger scale, many member states of the United Nations saying, well, look, we're always being told about the international rules-based order. Many of us, of course, are subscribers to the International Criminal Court, unlike the United States. But the United States was, of course, very supportive of the ICC when it issued arrest warrants against President Putin for his illegal invasion of Ukraine. And the double standards, of course, which you pointed to on numerous occasions, but is becoming so glaring that many people are wondering, where does the rule of international law go from here? Where is the consistency? What basis can countries like Britain, US, Germany, etc., argue for the world to support Ukraine, but take a completely hypocritical position when it comes to Palestine?
Well, I think this is one of the most important dynamics that lies outside the immediate conflict itself. So, of course, we're all hugely concerned for the fate of Palestinians in Gaza. As I said, 1.1 million of them in famine-like conditions, and the atrocities that are going on there. But for the longer term, there is also this huge battle as to what it means to have a rules-based order. And I think the rest of the world does see the hypocrisy and the double standards that the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and various other allies of Israel, and there's a shrinking number of them, are exhibiting here. And take one small point. One of the arguments is that the International Criminal Court doesn't have jurisdiction over Israel because Israel is not a member state. This is nonsense. The International Criminal Court has made it very clear in a ruling some years ago that it does have jurisdiction. But that jurisdiction point was never made, of course, by those states when it was Vladimir Putin as president of Russia involved. Russia is not a signatory to the International Criminal Court, their own statute. So there is a huge amount of hypocrisy. But this is not new either, because we have seen for years, decades, the way in which the United States has vetoed draft resolutions of the Security Council critical of Israeli conduct, that it has sought to ensure that various states adhere to Security Council resolutions. One thinks of Iraq, for example. But when it comes to Israel, Israel today is still in breach of Security Council resolutions that were passed back in the 70s and 80s. But what we are seeing is it's just got that much worse. It's got that much more blatant, and that international law has become a tool of the leading powers, as opposed to something that is meant to be there to protect the vulnerable, to protect those who have no power, to protect people in refugee camps, those who really have nothing. And this is exactly what the rest of the world is seeing. And I think in years to come, we're going to have situations where the United States and Britain and other countries are going to criticize the human rights records of various nations. And they're going to say, sorry, get lost. But, you're not prepared to tell your allies when they're in the wrong and hold them to account. So don't come knocking on our door with this stuff.
Yeah.
I think that is going to be an argument that will have a lot of traction across the world, quite frankly, unless and until Israel is held to account. But, let's take some positives here. We are seeing for the first time, both from the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, some action. And I think the key is now to ensure there is proper support, political support, that ensures the independence of the court, that it's allowed to carry out its deliberations, and that its rulings are respected, both of these courts, but also that they're properly funded. There's no playing around with that, which is an easy way to try to shut down investigations if the funds dry up, and to ensure that no matter who, whether they're Hamas actors and leaders or Israeli ones, that they are held to account for what they have done.
I mean, Chris, moving on slightly to a threat, I think it was made by Benny Gantz, who was part of the coalition, but obviously leader of the main opposition party, to leave that coalition. I think it was by June the 8th, if he hadn't been persuaded that there was a post-conflict plan for Gaza. Was also followed up a week or so later by another statement by Netanyahu's national security advisor, where he said, actually, this war could go on for another 7 months. At which point, Senator Blinken and the United States began to get rather nervous again and started talking about, well, they didn't start talking about red lines, but they started talking about the necessity for a plan. I mean, given that there isn't a plan, and given that perhaps there won't be one by June the 8th, what do you think happens with this coalition? Do you also think that the National Security Advisor is being serious when he talks about another 7 years, another 7 months of this carnage?
I would be very dubious about specific timeframes that a lot of these Israeli figures are putting out there. There was another minister who came out and said this could go on for as long as 10 years. I think one has to be, cautious about these figures that are bandied about. But I think where the United States comes into this is that President Biden does want to see an end to all of this. He does not want headlines about Israel's conduct in Gaza in the papers, in the media, as he heads into that November election. He needs that like a hole in the head. I think for him, he needs to see Israel coming out of this, agreeing to a plan that is credible. He needs to see an end to the starvation in Gaza, the manner in which Israel has conducted this war. Of course, where it all falls apart, he's not prepared to really back that up with meaningful action that could compel Israel to do it. And he, more than anybody else on the planet, has all the levers by which he could do this. He could starve Israel of all the munitions that has been dropping on Gaza every day. They roughly strike Gaza on average about 300 times a day. If you block that pipeline of weapons, then Israel would have to reconsider its position. And the United States isn't prepared to do that. I mean, it's also not prepared to put real pressure to get the aid into Gaza. I mean, we've had this whole shenanigans over both the airdrops and also this floating pier. I mean, we have a floating pier that costs $320 million set up in Gaza. And it's pretty much been dismantled by the rough seas. It hasn't worked. It's hardly delivered any aid whatsoever. It has been really expensive public relations disaster, frankly, because it was never the right way to deliver aid into Gaza. And the airdrops, I mean, my God, I mean, they were killing people rather than saving lives. And they are the most illogical, ineffective way of trying to deliver aid into a besieged enclave where you cannot have any control on how the much needed food and medicine and water gets to those most in need. So we have seen so much from the United States that is really just for show, frankly, and not meaningful policies. And I don't think we're going to see some great Israeli plan. Because the Israeli government is so divided. The fact you have Benny Gantz, the fact you have the defense minister as well, remind you, you have Gallant, both saying that they need to see this plan and they might leave the coalition. Will they? I'm not sure. I think Netanyahu will call their bluff. But there are other sections of Netanyahu's coalition who want to recolonize Gaza, to put the settlements back, who are actively trying to stop aid getting into Gaza. All those settlers and far-right activists who've been stopping the aid going into Gaza. Quite extraordinary. These people are dying of starvation and they think this is the right thing to do and that's helpful. I mean, so there is no plan because in many ways they can't agree on one. And the only thing they agree on is to continue the bombardment and the shelling for as long as possible.
Which some, I mean, I'm not a military analyst, but I mean, my dad was in the army, and his generation, they'd all served in these places like Malaya and Aden and Cyprus and what have you. And the equivalent always to me of a British response in those places would have been to completely level Nicosia or Kuala Lumpur or whatever. This is what has been happening in Gaza. And I've been watching some of these military analysts actually saying, well, on their own terms, the IDF and the Israelis are failing actually in Gaza, because no sooner than they enter Rafah than it flares up again in northern Gaza. They haven't, not only have they not got a political plan, but their military plan isn't working either. So yeah, I mean,
criticism, Mark. I mean, you cannot just deploy military force without an overall strategy that is achievable. And right from the outset, Netanyahu set some goals like the elimination of Hamas that were always unachievable through force. And he has essentially tried to keep all of this going because he knew until recently, at least, that he needs the crisis, that to stay in office, he wants it. And we are seeing a classic scenario of using military force without a proper overall strategy. And we've seen that, I'm afraid, also in the way in which the United States has conducted many military operations in the Middle East and Afghanistan, where the aims and ambitions of those operations weren't clear. And you see military forces carrying out, doing their job as instructed, but really hamstrung because there isn't a proper political strategy. And I think in Gaza, this actually goes back pre-7th of October. We have seen 17 years of a military blockade. Everybody who knew anything about Gaza knew that this was failing, that this was actually playing into the hands of the more extreme elements, that it was Hamas who was benefiting from all of this. And today, that is still the case. Support for Hamas is going up, it's getting funding. If your aim is to eliminate Hamas, they are doing exactly the opposite of what they should have been doing. They should have been reaching out to Palestinian civilians, those who aren't involved with Hamas, really helping them, rather than this blanket bombing, collective punishment, imposing a total siege. If you really believed that Hamas alone was the problem, then you need to have worked with the host Palestinian community, as opposed to treating them as enemies, as opposed to saying that if you bomb a particular building, if you kill 20 to 30 Palestinian civilians in taking out a Hamas militant. No, it's not okay. And the way in which this is being conducted, largely using artificial intelligence, is quite chilling, is something that is also a worrying sign about the way in which war might be conducted in the future. This is not the way forward.
No, and actually listening to you then, and the conversation we've been having about a plan or a lack of a plan. Of course, what the one thing that we have learned is that the crudity of any plan was effectively the Netanyahu one, to play off Hamas against Fatah, and so it kind of suited.
Plan. I mean, divide and rule. I mean, the British, we historically specialized in this form of colonial control. Look at the way in which we managed the Raj in India. Divided rule has been something that the far right in Israel has mastered in, going back to Sharon, Netanyahu as well. So Netanyahu is deeply opposed to the Palestinian Authority retaking control of Gaza, because he doesn't want to lose one of the stellar victories of the last 20 years, the division of the West Bank from Gaza, the divisions between Fatah and Hamas, this fragmentation politically, demographically, and geographically of the Palestinian people is a huge achievement in the eyes of Netanyahu and his fellow travelers. So the last thing he wants to see is the Palestinian Authority looking more like a Palestinian national government, looking more like, dare I say it, a state, a Palestinian state, something that Netanyahu has always, in his DNA opposed.
Yes, I mean, I think one thing that, and really finally, I suppose, Chris, because we're running out of time, but one thing that you hear time and time again from people is that, given the strength of popular feeling, and I'm not just talking about the large demonstrations that have taken place right across the world, but particularly here in Britain and the United States, and what's been happening on university campuses and what have you, but overall public opinion has been very clear right from almost from the start, actually, on all of this. It's been wanting a ceasefire, it's been wanting an end to the conflict. It's become also progressively more and more shocked and appalled by what it's seeing. But yet still, it seems to have so little effect on the governing political parties and politicians. And it brings me neatly onto the British general election, because clearly Gaza, Palestine, Israel is an issue in this general election. It has been immediately prior in the by-election in Rochdale. And of course, since there have been some significant defections from the Labour Party ranks, and this issue is kind of bubbling up also around various candidates who have been selected or deselected and what have you. I suppose the question is do you Do you foresee any difference in approach from a possible Starmer-led government to the Sunak government? Do you think that things might change vis-a-vis recognition of Palestine, for instance, vis-a-vis perhaps, recognition that the ICJ and the ICC, if they make these rulings, they've got to be supported? Do you have any hope that things might be a bit better?
Well, I like to be optimistic. Let's just take public opinion. And we've done several opinion polls as Caabu since the 7th of October. And consistently, what we find in Britain is that over 70% support an immediate ceasefire. We find a majority of the British electorate support an arms embargo on Israel. So we see this also replicated across Europe. A poll in 5 EU states found pretty much similar findings. We find in Italy, actually, I think the figure was something in the region of 65% in support of an arms embargo on Israel. And so to find these political leaderships so out of kilter with public sentiment is really quite extraordinary. And I think worrying going forward, you should never wish to see that. Now, is there going to be change in Britain? It does look likely that Labour will win the general election now called for the 4th of July. And I think we have to be quite clear that this Conservative government has been utterly dreadful in its handling of this crisis. Right from the outset, it has refused to hold Israel accountable in any way, shape or form for what it's done in Gaza. It refuses to issue any determination as to whether Britain believes that it's violated international law, although the evidence is so overwhelming, it's quite, remarkable. It's not going to countenance any form of arms embargo. Labour definitely at the beginning of all of this, particularly in the form of the leadership, and I'm afraid one does have to talk about Keir Starmer in this, was very reluctant to be critical. And we saw that much viewed radio interview he did on LBC, where he refused to condemn the imposition of a total siege on Gaza. This now something that the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court is taking forward because he is alleging that Israel has been using starvation as a weapon of war. The reluctance to call for an immediate ceasefire. But on certain issues, Labour is certainly not as poor as the Conservatives. It has backed the International Court of Justice measures. It's called that Israel should adhere to them. It has backed the International Criminal Court in a far more outspoken fashion. I think that David Lammy articulated that in the House of Commons recently. Labour might recognise a state of Palestine, whereas I think a Conservative government will never recognise a state of Palestine unless Israel was okay with that, unless there was an Israeli government that supported it. So I think there is a chance with an incoming Labour government to put pressure on it. I think the grassroots of the party and much of the parliamentary Labour Party back a much tougher approach. So we would have the opportunity, I think, to push for a British policy that maybe one day we could be proud of, that did actually put international law and conflict resolution at the heart of their policy, which at the moment the current government does not. But we mustn't assume that a Labour government is going to do all of these things. We will need to keep the pressure up. It requires voters to make their views very well known over the next 5 weeks.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much indeed. A lot of food for thought there. We wish you all the best with all the work that you're doing, and please come and speak to us again soon. Thank you very much.
It's always a pleasure, Mark. Thank you very much. And I have so much time for what a Palestinian Deep Dive is doing. Thank you.
Thank you.